Hello and welcome to Fantasy View. This is the podcast for reviews of fantasy novels because I've read a whole hell of a lot and I want to give you my recommendations for what to read, what to skip, and what to burn. But only after you buy it, of course. I'm Jason Hubbard, and this next review is for an author who's not exactly independently published, but still, I believe that she doesn't get the recognition that she deserves. Her name is Carol Browne, and she lives somewhere in jolly old England, I believe. I could be wrong about that. The name of her book is The Exile of Elindel. Now, if you have to ask yourself, what is Elendil? I never heard of this Elendil before. Then you might have to question yourself whether or not you're actually a fan of fantasy. Because, fantasy fans like myself, we look at a name like this, and it's a given that it's just a made-up name for a made-up town or maybe even a nation. In order to find out just what Elendil is, you'll just have to go ahead and read the book, don't you? That's just part of the joy of discovery. Now, let me review this cover here. Now, I know that books often go from one new cover to the next, but still, I have a feeling that this ebook is going to keep this cover for quite a long time. So there's a live model of what I can assume is the main character of the book. And this model looks to be about 5 or 6 or 7 years old, and yet the main character is said to be 16 years old. 16, and I can't even tell what the gender is. Is that a boy or a girl? Well, obviously it's a girl because the main character is a girl. And she's dressed in what looks like a robe with a cowl, like she's a druid or something. And this robe has a zipper. I mean, this story takes place in England in the Middle Ages, in the very early Middle Ages. And yet we have a robe with a zipper on it. So, instant fail, I'm sorry to say. The background is, I think it's a computer illustration, and it is passable at best. It just seems to be the woods and a sword and a stone. Is this Excalibur? No, I don't think so. So the story begins with our main character, whose name is Elgiva, which is a name I don't really like. I don't know, maybe it's the G. She starts off with literally hugging a tree. And thousands of miles away, Al Gore sheds a tear of joy. He says, "There's someone out there who loves trees as much as I do." So, what is Elgiva hugging this tree for? Is she trying to stop some land developers? Is she trying to climb the tree? Maybe she loves this tree very, very much, if you know what I mean, you know what I mean? No, it's because Elgiva wants to talk with this tree. Because Elgiva is an elf. And elves in this world, in many other fantasy worlds, they can talk with trees and animals. And she says that trees usually spend much of their lives just sleeping, but so she tries to wake this one up. And she gives the tree her sob story. Basically, she was exiled from the elven city of Elendil. So, henceforth, she is the Exile of Elindel. What do you know? Now, her mentor had told her that as soon as she left the city, she should seek out a tree and ask it for advice, just because they're very old and wise. Why he couldn't really give her helpful advice, I'm not really sure. The tree says that she should seek out human beings, more specifically Saxons. Now, if you know your English history, Saxons are, one of several nomadic tribes that crossed the English Channel, and they tried to populate the entire English island. This advice doesn't really appeal to Elgiva because, it's said that the Saxons are barbarians, so say historians. And, Saxons, like all humans, they cut down trees and eat meat, which the elves simply don't do. But nonetheless, she goes out to search for some Saxons because since she's exiled from the elves, she's going to have to learn to live among humans. And a magic spell disguises her as a Saxon, and she happens upon the Three Stooges. At least I just call them the Three Stooges. One of them is a young Saxon lord. What's his name? Yes. That's his name. What's his name? And his two servants, one of them is not a Saxon. He is a Briton. Apparently, you can tell Britons and Saxons apart. If that makes me racist, well, I'm a white guy myself, so yeah, go ahead and report me. Now, you might think that the Three Stooges start drooling after her just because she's a young girl who's all alone. Fortunately, that is not the case, because that would be a mite uncomfortable. They are pretty suspicious of her, though, because they believe she might be from another village and poaching on their land. The Briton servant is named Godwin, and as soon as the Three Stooges and Elgiva reach the Saxon village, Godwin is tasked with giving Elgiva some shelter. So he brings her to his humble abode, where he says, "Surely I don't mind if you dance on a pole. It don't make you a hoe. Surely I don't mind if you're working till 3. You'll be coming up with me. Surely I don't." Man, I sound like such a perv. Well, okay. Godwin does not start hitting on her. For good reason. I mean, he's married with 2 daughters. So, yes, he's a Briton who has a Saxon wife and, 2 crossbreed daughters. And so Elgiva wonders what his deal is. How come he's a Briton living in a Saxon village? Well, Godwin says that back when he was very little, he did live in a Briton village, but he was captured during a raid, by some Saxons, and he was reared as a Saxon servant ever since. But he says, even though he's a servant and he's not allowed to bear arms, his life wasn't really all that cruel, just as long as he obeyed orders, of course. And yet, he was allowed to take a wife and have children. So he says life wasn't all that bad, but he does admit that he was dealt a very unfair hand. But of course, sometimes you have to play with the hand that life deals you. Now, I must admit, at about this part of the story, I was starting to get some very wild expectations. I was starting to believe that maybe the story was going to be like, very similar to Dances with Wolves. Like, this was going to be like a fantasy Dances with Wolves. Dances with Wolves is, it began as a book and now it's a movie about a Civil War soldier who almost died during a battle, and he almost had his leg amputated. And after the battle, he requested to be posted to an abandoned outpost out in the middle of nowhere. And out there, he begins relations with a Native American tribe. And he joins up with this tribe, and he eventually becomes just a part of the tribe. And the Native Americans show him their ways and vice versa. And he even gives them rifles to hunt and wage war with. So I was expecting Elgiva to stay in this Saxon village for quite a long time, like maybe years. And she would show the Saxon people her ways and reveal that she has some magic powers. She would use them for healing purposes, perhaps even hunting. And they would grow distrustful of her at first, but eventually they would warm up to her and begin to become very dependent on her. And then maybe one day her mentor would show up and he would say, Elgiva, when we exiled you from the city, we didn't exactly give you permission to start using your magic for the humans. So could you please just stop doing that? That would be great, yeah. And then Elgiva would say, "Oh no, Pappy. You see, when the king exiled me, he said that I no longer existed. So why don't you just go away, do what the king told you to do. Just pretend that I no longer exist." And then more elves would show up, and they would express their displeasure with Elgiva, and they would demand that she comes back with them. And then the humans would express their displeasure and demand that Elgiva stays with them. And then, of course, that would lead to some angry stares across the table, and then lead to war, and maybe some blood would be shed, or maybe not. A fantasy version of Dances with Wolves. And I was kind of looking forward to that, because, Even though it wouldn't be exactly original, it would be like Dancing with Wolves. Still, I like Dances with Wolves, and having this kind of story in a fantasy setting would be really cool. It would be very emotional at the very least. But as I said, I was just having wild expectations, and in the end, those expectations did not pan out. And I think that's really too bad, because the story ends up being yet another fantasy story about destiny and inheritance. Yeah, you know what I mean. There are so many fantasy stories about destiny and inheritance, as well as many sci-fi space operas. For example, there's the story of Star Wars. Luke Skywalker starts out as a simple farm boy, and then he ends the movie as a renegade fighter. And then in the next movie, we discover his mama got hit with the evil stick. So, Luke Skywalker could have stayed relatively normal. He could have been, just a simple farm boy who managed to rise above his station. But no, destiny and inheritance, they rear their ugly heads. And now there are just so many stories, especially movies, that pretty much copy Star Wars in that regard. So going back to the story, Elgiva and Godwyn get separated from the village because there's another Saxon raid. They're kidnapped for ransom. The two of them are rescued by a pack of wolves, because that's just the kind of story this is. Elgiva says that she has no intention of returning to the Saxon village, and she says that Godwyn should go back because, he has to go back to his wife and kids. But Godwyn does not want to leave her for pretty good reasons, because he wants to be a very good friend to her, and he wants to at least escort her back to her village, which he probably thinks will be a cinch. And so the rest of the story is pretty much about the two of them going on this dangerous journey, encountering villains and revelations. And even though Elgiva is pretty much the main character, much of the story is told through Godwyn's point of view. Probably because he's the outsider, a human in the land of the elves, and so we can relate with him. And so ultimately the story did not turn out to be quite as original as I was hoping it would be. But does that mean this is a bad story? No, not at all. That's definitely not what I'm suggesting. For one thing, the book is very well written. Much of the exposition, the background story, is told through dialogue, which is probably for the best. I find that exposition is often best told through dialogue, because dialogue tends to be much less dry than the narration. And the story is certainly epic, but it's epic in a kind of a quiet way. Now sure, there are some battles, and they're not exactly bloodless, but even so, there's nothing really mind-blowing going on here. The strength of the story really lies in the relationship between the two leads, Elgiva and Godwyn. There is some potential for romance there, but whether or not it actually comes to that, I won't tell. Now, I imagine some people might say, so it's very well written, so what? I've read a bunch of books and they're all well written. I don't see why this one is considered to be any special. Well, I believe that if you see a lot of high-quality movies and TV shows, and of course read a lot of high-quality books, you tend to take high quality for granted. And I just don't want to do that here. Especially since, in the author's note at the very beginning, she says that she first wrote this book way back in 1977. But she didn't get a publisher to agree to publish it until the year 2013. Hot damn, that is a long time for, editing and polishing. So should this be considered an epic fail? No, I don't think so. I believe you can write the best book of all damn time, and yet getting an agent and or a publisher willing to take you on is very, very tough. You can certainly help your case by having some contacts within the industry. And indeed, the author Carol Browne does list a lot of people who helped her along the way, but even so, it took her, over 30 years to get this finally published, and despite all those people that she thanked, it still just took her a very long time. That's just the very nature of the industry, I believe. So again, this story was written back in 1977. Oh man, you know what that means. You'll have to imagine Elgiva and Godwyn with really big hair and bell bottoms and go-go boots. And whenever there's the battle scene, the soundtrack is like, "We be kung fu fighting." Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Oh, Carol Browne. If you happen to be listening, you cannot deny that you were a part of the scene. And maybe you had a big crush on John Travolta because, hey, all the young girls had a crush on him. And then he converted to Scientology, so good for him, I guess. So, yes, I do recommend The Exile of Elendil, which is part 1 in a series, by the way. Even though it's a hesitant recommendation because, I don't know, I just don't always like it when there's a magical MacGuffin that acts as a win button. You know what I mean? There's so many fantasy stories out there with magical MacGuffins. You know, magical relics and artifacts that help to drive the plot. Like, oh, I don't know, the One Ring of Power. But even so, you know, the One Ring of Power is a double-edged sword. It's extremely useful in that it can make you invisible, and yet it poisons your mind. So the One Ring does act like a win button. You know, you just press the button, and then instantly, hooray! All the bad guys are defeated, and the good guys win. But even so, you know, to press that button, it's not easy. Frodo has to go right into the middle of enemy territory and go inside a volcano and throw the ring right into the lava. You know, of course, it doesn't exactly happen that way, but even so, the ring goes into the lava, it melts down, and the bad guys are instantly defeated. In The Exile of Elendil, there's also a magical win button, and unfortunately, it's not quite as tough to press as it is in The Lord of the Rings. So, I can't say anything more, but consider yourself warned. So, other than that, I don't really have a lot of bad things to say about The Exile of Elendil. I do highly recommend it. In my next review, though, I think it's going to be a different story. So, until then, thank you for listening, and please keep reading.